I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you episode number 58, the final episode of 2014, in this podcast dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the villains of the brain, neurotoxins, those chemicals that are specifically awful for our brains, our neurons, our thought processes, all that stuff. We're going to be speaking with a scientist named Dr. David Bellinger, who has made his career out of studying such things. Which neurotoxins are the worst, how bad they are for us, and of course, how we can avoid them and keep them out of our brains, out of the brains of our loved ones, and how to keep them from screwing us up to the largest extent possible. If you hang around until the end of the episode, in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, I'm going to tell you about how the speed of your thought can affect the quality of your diet. Now, note that that's not what you might think it would be. It's not how the quality of your diet might affect the speed of your thought, but the other way around. And because there's probably feedback there in both directions, we have the possibility for both a virtuous or a vicious circle, depending on what those inputs and outputs are. So hang around for that. But in the meantime, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So for those of you who are rooting for computers to eventually overtake and replace humans as the dominant species on the planet, December was another month that showed positive signs in the sense that computational researchers at MIT now have a neural net computer that is as good as a primate brain for quickly identifying objects within photos. This is something where humans and primates and basically everything other than computers has had a major head start for a long time and have been much better about being able to have a flashing glance at an image and recognize key visual elements within it. But as of now, the top-end neural net computers can now match the performance of a primate in this sort of task. What they've done, neural nets have been something that scientists have been mucking about with and getting increasingly proficient with since the 1970s. And the idea is to build a computer whose hardware architecture is really deliberately modeled on the way that we think brains work, rather than something which is built purely for computational input-output on the model of an Apple IIe or an off-the-shelf desktop computer. So as best we can tell, when animals are looking at things, obviously we've got light that's coming into our eyes, activating photoreceptive cells within our retina, which transmit information through the optic nerve into our brain, where further processing takes place, and this visual information actually gets turned into idea sorts of information, where a bunch of pixels that might look like a dog actually get turned into the idea dog. And in the brain, this seems to happen sort of through multiple levels of processing, each of which identify the most essential information in making this analysis and then throws out a bunch of information. This is kind of the way all of our senses work, where we're constantly getting bombarded by way more information than our brains need or even want to make sense of the world. And so there's a giant sort of filtration process before it gets down to the things that our conscious attention is able to perceive and encourage to focus on. So the scientists at MIT have tried to build their neural nets in the same way, doing some basic computation on the incoming visual data sequentially, handing this information, which comes in sort of as pixel type information, upstream as it gets turned into more and more abstract shapes, and those shapes are grouped into objects, and those objects are sequentially identified. The reason that there's been progress made in this is because of both the speed of computational processing has gone up as graphical processing units have gotten cheaper and faster, and there's also really large data sets available now as far as different images that humans have gone through and said, okay, this is a picture of a dog, this is a picture of a Cocker Spaniel, this is a picture of a old Cocker Spaniel, and so sort of tagged different images with all sorts of information. So now when these neural nets are given access to these giant backlogs of pre-tagged information, and they can start making guesses and find out whether their guesses are accurate or not, these learning machines are able to make increasingly accurate guesses as to whether the sensory input that they're getting from the outside world matches with their expectations based on this data set that they've had access to. Now, what's interesting is, despite the fact that there's now a neural network that is as good as a primate in recognizing objects, because this machine learning is sort of happening in a self-directed sort of way, the computer scientists still don't understand exactly how it's doing what it's doing. So it's funny, in mimicking the brain with a computer, we now find ourselves being almost as confused by how the computer does what it does as we are with the same questions about the brain. So a little bit of irony there, but nevertheless a really interesting breakthrough in machine learning, and maybe a step eventually towards what we would call machine cognition.
Smart Drug Smarts.
And in news a little bit closer to home, picked up 2 more 5-star reviews on iTunes from a couple of listeners. Oi Molly and Blue and White Android, who wrote respectively, "Wow, these episodes are amazing. Thank you for doing what you do." And Smart Drug Smarts is a fantastic podcast if you need well-balanced discussion on the topic of nootropics. I believe Jesse comes into each podcast with a healthy dose of skepticism. I appreciate this and the hard work and diligence. So thank you to both of you, and to everybody actually that's taken the time to leave a message or rating or review on iTunes or Stitcher. It's really, really a big help. At this point, we're actually pretty well established and entrenched in the list of medicine-related podcasts on iTunes, and we have no one but our listeners to thank for that. So thank you so much for those of you who have taken the 3 to 5 minutes to say something nice about us. That is not to be understated. I also got some feedback by email from a listener, Dawn, who had listened to the episode from a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Thomas Seyfried. You guys may remember that one as the episode about ketosis and cancer and how keeping your body in a ketotic state, where your cells are operating on the ketone bodies made from the breakdown of fat rather than glucose or glycogen, can sort of unmask a potentially fatal problem in cancer cells, which is that they don't have properly functioning mitochondria and they cannot function correctly in a sugar-free environment. And so by knocking your body into ketosis, you can sort of starve out cancer cells, or at least keep them from proliferating. Anyway, this listener, Dawn, heard that episode, thought it was interesting, passed on the episode to a doctor that works, I guess, in an investment group that he's a part of, and got some pretty positive corroboration of Dr. Seyfried's ideas from his doctor. I'm going to be lifting from this email since it was a rather long email, but this doctor replied, "Hi, Dawn. Seyfried is right along one axis, along one dimension. For a cancer to succeed, it has to be successful along multiple axes, such as oncogenes that drive growth, methods of dodging or suppressing the immune system, and methods of overriding the intrinsic urge to cell death by apoptotic suicide. He is right along the nutritional axis. Cancer cells are quite perverse as regards nutrients and have quirky pathways and can be quite stunted by ketogenic diets. A former student of mine did a PhD dissertation on this, looking at diet as a management strategy for prostate cancer in both mice and men. The problem is that ketogenic diets are very hard for people to stay on. People can get weak, dizzy, headachy, insomniac, and highly irritable. The second issue is that such diets tend to be oncostatic. They prevent cancer growth, but not oncocytal. They do not kill any or many cancer cells. So thanks for that feedback, Don. Much appreciated. And as I threw out on the last episode, I'm really thinking, in the wake of having heard that interview with Dr. Seyfried, that I'm going to be doing a 7-day water fast at some point in the coming year, probably sooner rather than later, probably kind of get it out of the way as a spring cleaning type thing. The idea being that if there are any little bundles of cancer cells buried somewhere in my body, it might be possible to essentially starve them out. And Dr. Seyfried recommended possibly doing this as sort of a once-a-year ritual to keep a person cancer-free. Obviously, a pretty major commitment as far as willpower and not feeling on top of your game for a few days. But I threw that out there and got a fair number of interested listeners. I think there's about 7 of us now that are tentatively committed to doing such a thing. So if you've got any interest in joining up in something like this, try to email me in the next week. I'm going to put together this little list, and then once we've got everybody that feels like they're going to be signing up, we'll make a plan for exactly when we're going to do this at a time that would be as convenient as possible for people's schedules. My email is Jesse, that's JESSE, at smartdrugsmarts.com. And if living on water for 7 days straight sounds like something you want no part of, I do not blame you. But hopefully this far less demanding interview about how to avoid neurotoxins will be equally beneficial in a smaller willpower tax. So Dr. David Bellinger is a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. He's a professor in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard School of Public Health and a senior research associate in neurology and psychiatry at the Children's Hospital Boston. His research has been funded primarily by the National Institute of Health and by the EPA, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and Harvard University. He first came to my attention because of an article published in the Atlantic Monthly maybe about 6 or 8 months ago. He was sort of the headline scientist. It was an article all about neurotoxins. I think they had it broken down into like the toxic 12, the terrible 12, something like that. If you imagine, the chemicals as the FBI's most wanted list. Anyway, what the 12 chemical compounds are that occupy those most hated spots for the brain-owning members of the human species, figuring out what compounds those are, what's doing the most damage, and of course, what we can change both as far as public policy choices and lifestyle decisions to give each of us as little exposure as possible to these nasty chemicals. I was very fortunate to be able to catch Dr. Bellinger in the midst of the holiday season and really, really want to thank him for taking the time out of his holiday schedule to do this interview and to share these ideas with our audience.
Well, I started out in this field about 35 years ago. At that time, the major issue from an environmental standpoint was lead toxicity in children. And it was a very controversial issue. It was around the time that many were advocating for removal of lead from gasoline and from paint and so on. Some people felt the data were strong enough to support those initiatives, and other people, especially those who were going to lose money because of it, fought it quite bitterly. And so I was involved in a series of studies that were basically asking the question, how much lead is too much for children? At what levels of exposure do we start to see some diminution in their cognitive abilities? And the lead story more or less got resolved. It hasn't gone away as a problem because we keep finding out it's worse than we thought. But similar kinds of research attention has now been directed to other sorts of chemicals. So in recent years, I've worked on methylmercury, where fish consumption is the primary pathway of exposure to that form of mercury, and done studies on dental amalgam, which is 50% metallic mercury by weight. So we did a randomized trial where we took children who had fairly substantial dental needs and provided them with dental care and randomized the children to either have their cavities filled with dental amalgam or what is now the primary alternative. It's a composite resin material. And we looked to see whether or not there was any difference in the children's cognitive abilities after 5 years. We have a set of studies going on internationally in Bangladesh and Mexico and in the United States that are looking at the impact of children's exposures to more than one metal at a time. So the metals that we're focusing on are arsenic, manganese, and lead. And so our studies in Bangladesh are cited there because back in the 90s it was discovered that the groundwater was heavily contaminated with arsenic. Just geologically, nobody was putting it there, just running off of the Himalayas and getting into the drinking water. And so there are many studies going on now about arsenic and cardiovascular disease and cancers in adults. And recently there's been a concern that arsenic affects the brain as well. Get an answer to that question, it would be good to go to a site like that where the exposures are generally higher than they are in the United States. But we also discovered that children are highly exposed to other things as well, which is, of course, always the case. We're not exposed to just one thing. It's mixtures. But mixtures are very hard to study and have not received much attention. We've tended to look one chemical at a time. But we learned that in Bangladesh, the children are also exposed to fairly high levels of manganese and lead. Chemical mixtures is the major focus of that study, as well as the one that we're doing in Mexico City.
In the world today, what are some of the greatest areas of danger in our current environment? And given the things that people could be exposed to going around in the world right now, what are the changes that people can make in their individual lives to protect themselves neurologically and their families?
Well, I think even though lead is an old story, it's unfortunately still a big problem, less so in the developed countries because of regulatory initiatives that have been taken. But as I say, it's not something that we can ignore. But internationally, it really has not been on the radar screen, and perhaps for understandable reasons, where issues like malnutrition and infectious diseases are garner much more attention. But lead kind of goes under the radar, and it shows up in surprising places. We have done studies in India as well as Bangladesh, and we're quite surprised to find the levels of exposure there. Lead in gasoline is not used except in, I think there are now 6 countries in the world only. But lead is just a very useful metal. It shows up in a lot of unexpected places. And so the WHO, the World Health Organization, has done a global burden of disease attributable to lead. And what they found was that well over 90% of the children with worrisome levels of exposure are in developing countries. I've been surprised by the literature that's coming out on pesticides. I mean, not surprised that pesticides are neurotoxic. We've known that for a long time. They're designed to be poisonous to the nervous system of insects, and our nervous system works pretty much the same way an insect's does. But there are several long-term prospective studies going on in primarily the United States that have focused on pesticide exposure and are reporting adverse effects at levels that are highly prevalent in the population. And so certainly in terms of practical steps, if it's possible to eat as much organic produce as possible, especially for very young children when their brains are still developing, I think, and during pregnancy. That seems to me probably one of the handful of steps, I think, that would be most beneficial.
Yeah, I'd love to actually talk a little bit more about that. Looking at it from a macro level of society, kind of the bang for the buck of protecting pregnant women's physiology and young children's brains versus trying to do things for those of us that are already teens or adults plus. Let's say that the federal government decides to throw $10 billion at this program. How much of that $10 billion should be allocated specifically to pregnant women and very young children versus the adult population?
I would devote the great majority to the pregnant women and the young children. Brain development is such an exquisitely complex process. Many things are happening at the same time. And things have to happen in a certain order. The right things have to happen at the right time in order to end up with a fully typical brain. And we know that many of these environmental chemicals can interfere with signaling processes that are important in cell-cell communication, that are critical in terms of establishing synapses and neural circuits that underlie complex cognitive functions. A colleague of mine published a book called Only One Chance. A child only gets one chance to develop a good brain. And anything that interferes with this beautiful choreography involved in brain development has the potential to produce a cascade of effects that cannot be reversed. I mean, we know that, for instance, the IQ losses that result from elevated lead exposure are very difficult to reverse. There may be some things that we can do to blunt the impact a bit, but I think that in large part, once the damage is done, there's really not much that can be done. And so we want to make sure that we give children the best start that we can, and that's going to mean targeting pregnant women and then children through the early years when their brain is developing so rapidly.
If somebody was trying to live in an optimal place for just a healthy environment neurologically, where might that be?
Well, I think the developed countries are doing the best job. I'm not going to say that they're doing everything they could be doing. Certainly that's not true. But I think that the procedures are in place for addressing these questions and taking steps that are responsive. We still have not reached the point where we anticipate problems and act proactively. For that, I actually think Europe, the European Union, is a bit ahead of the United States because they now have procedures in place whereby the commercial entity must demonstrate the safety of a chemical before it can be introduced into the marketplace. That is totally the opposite in the United States, where we basically allow companies to introduce chemicals and then we look to see whether or not down the road there's a problem developing, and then we try to play catch-up. It's a very reactionary kind of approach rather than a proactive approach.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because to get a drug through the FDA, something that's meant to be put into the human body, there's obviously a huge amount of testing that goes in up front, but all of these things that will still wind up in our bodies and our bloodstreams just through non-eating sorts of exposure, there's a wide open door for.
Yeah, absolutely. We're just basically doing a set of experiments on ourselves and our children, and our children's brains, and hoping for the best, but I think history tells us that hope is a bit of a self-delusion. Even with lead, back in the 1920s is when lead was introduced as a gasoline additive, and it was very controversial. There were public health folks saying, don't introduce this as a poison, and if you do introduce it, then we're going to have a slow process of poisoning of the population that's going to even be difficult to perceive because it's going to be so slow but so widespread. Nevertheless, it was approved. Gasoline was approved, and those people saying we should be careful about this were shown to be quite prescient because it was not until the 1970s, even into the 80s, that the process of taking lead out of gasoline really got underway. So for 60 years, we exposed the population. If I were given the task of maximizing population exposure to a brain poison, I can't think of a better way than to put it into a mobile source, like an automobile, which goes everywhere. And also, let's line our homes with it in paint to make it accessible to everybody. So I think we were quite clever in a very unfortunate way. I think lead is really a lesson that we need to keep in mind when we think about these other newer chemicals about which we don't know very much. The plasticizers and bisphenol and polybrominated diphenyl ethers, the flame retardant materials, they're really ubiquitous and can be detected in just about everybody in their bodies.
Would it be accurate to say that based on these environmental exposures, you think the average person plucked off the street in a United States city is slightly dumber than they would have been 100 or 150 years ago in a more natural environment?
That's a very hard question to answer because so many other things have changed over the same time period. And we don't know for sure that for some chemicals, exposures might have been quite high back then. We know they wouldn't have been for, obviously, the newer materials that have only been synthesized in the last decade.
Yeah, plastics that have only been recently invented.
Right. And our environment provides a lot more stimulation, cognitive stimulation, and so on. So if everything else were equal in terms of influences on the brain, then I'd have to say, yes, we're probably a little bit dumber now than humans would have been if they had been magically transported back to that time when they weren't exposed to plasticizers and bisphenol A and PBDE, so on.
Let me pull you back for a moment to methyl mercury, the kind of mercury that's typically seen in fish and seafood. I spoke a couple of episodes ago with Dr. Michael Crawford from Imperial College London about seafood in particular, and that was one of the questions that I asked because he's a big proponent of seafood as being very healthy for physiology in general and brains in specific, and sort of poo-pooed the notion that mercury exposure from seafood was a problem. He cited some studies in Japan, which has a very high consumption of seafood, and that they really weren't seeing any neurological downsides in this highly exposed population that would be expected if sort of the seafood to brain pathway for methylmercury was as dangerous as some people might have us believe. What would you say about that?
Well, I agree that fish is very healthy, has lots of constituents, not just omega-3 fatty acids, but selenium, choline, low fat, high protein. But I would have to disagree with Professor Crawford. I think the evidence is actually quite compelling that you want to minimize the amount of mercury that especially pregnant women take in, because we know that pregnancy, prenatal development is by far the most sensitive window of vulnerability for methylmercury. And there are quite a lot of evidence from Japan, actually. In fact, that's where we first learned about the dangers of mercury during pregnancy in the episode in Minamata Bay. There was an acid-aldehyde factory that was using mercury salts as a catalyst in whatever production process they were using, and they were just discharging those salts right into the bay. And there were many subsistence fishermen in that area who were feeding their families with fish they took from Minamata Bay. And there were lots of deaths, actually. The exposures were so high. And children were born with what came to be called congenital Minamata disease. They had a cerebral palsy-like illness. They had cerebellar ataxia. Mental retardation was about tenfold higher than in surrounding areas. In some cases, the mothers of these children who were so severely affected were not affected at all. So it just speaks to the greater vulnerability of the fetus. So fortunately, we've never seen quite a repetition of that episode. The closest was in the 1970s in Iraq, when seed grain that had been treated with a mercury-based fungicide was distributed to Iraqi nomads, but unfortunately the warning signs were unknown to them. They didn't know what a skull and crossbones meant.
Would have hoped that one was universal.
Yeah, and the warnings about don't consume this, I don't believe was in the local language. So they ground up the seed grain and baked it into bread. And this resulted in a Minamata-like episode, not through fish, but it was still mercury poisoning. Those poisoning episodes then did stimulate people to ask the question, well, again, as we asked with lead, how much is too much? How much mercury is too much? And so people started to look for populations around the world where people consume a lot of fish, an important part of their diet. And so studies were begun in New Zealand and the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic and the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. Those are the three major large prospective studies. And the New Zealand study and the Faroe Island study both showed that higher consumption of fish that are contaminated with mercury, even though they're not impaired to the point where they would be diagnosed with a clinical disease, but the children born to women who consumed this mercury-contaminated fish and in the Faroe Islands had lower scores on cognitive tests. So those studies spawned the next generation of studies, which were done at even lower levels of exposure. We did some here in Boston, and there have been some in Spain. And as with lead, we keep pushing down the level at which we say, yes, we can see adverse effects. So I think it's prudent for people to be aware of what fish have more mercury than other fish, and to try to minimize consumption of those species, but still preserve the absolute benefits of consuming seafood. We don't want people saying, "Oh, I'm not going to eat fish. I'm going to go have a hot dog instead, or a pizza." That's no good. But we just want them to be aware of what fish are of concern, so that they can have a variety of fish in their diet and maximize their benefits and minimize their risks.
And as a rule, that tends to be fish that are low on the food chain, fish that are eating things like planktons rather than eating other fish and accumulating mercury. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. It's the large, long-lived predatory fish that eat other fish, that are at the top of the aquatic food chain. And actually, we're on top of that food chain because we eat swordfish, shark, albacore, tuna, that kind of thing. We're going to be getting more mercury than might be good for us. So it's salmon, flounder, cod, fish like that are lower. And even better, sardines and herring, which are very, very high in omega-3s and very low in mercury.
Jumping over to one of the other compounds that gets a lot of attention, fluoride, which is in all of our toothpaste and in a lot of places added to drinking water. That's also a known neurotoxin, but I know that different scientists are on different sides of the fence, that at low levels there can be some benefit to having some fluoride exposure. Where do you stand on that one?
Well, I think the jury is still out. There was a review paper of, I think it was 32 Chinese studies that was published a year or two ago. And those studies in aggregate did seem to indicate that children who lived in an area that had higher levels of fluoride naturally in the water had lower IQs by 6 or 7 points, as I recall, than children who lived in a village with low fluoride. Now, that kind of study is actually one of the weaker designs used in epidemiology. It's called an ecologic design. And the reason it's weak is because there could be many other differences between the villages besides fluoride that may influence children's development. So I think we have to be cautious in drawing inferences about causality in that case. I think it behooves us to get a good answer to this question because, again, it's something that's modifiable. We intentionally add fluoride, as you say, to lots of products. And so if we're doing something harmful, then, or if there's a way to do it to preserve the benefits, the dental benefits, and minimize the neurotoxicity risks, then, as with making careful choices in what fish you eat to get the benefits but not the mercury toxicity, the same would apply for fluoride.
Last question I had was identified within that article as sort of the 12 most nasty neurotoxins in the environment was good old ethanol, alcohol. Could you talk a little about that?
Well, we do know it kills brain cells. There's no question about that. And there's a long research tradition looking at the effects of maternal consumption during pregnancy. And of course, women are counseled to avoid alcohol, if possible, during pregnancy. Because there is this well-recognized fetal alcohol syndrome, and at lower levels of exposure, which is accompanied by particular dysmorphic features that the children can be identified by a skilled person just looking at the children because their faces have different characteristics, and reliably, as a group, the children resemble one another. And then at lower doses, there's alcohol-related developmental disabilities, ARDDs, and many, many studies have shown that, again, that the children whose moms drank a bit more during pregnancy have lower IQs, less success in school, more difficulty paying attention, and that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of controversy about whether it's one drink a week is okay, or whether it's only a binge drinking episode that delivers this bolus dose to the infant prenatal brain that is most hazardous. I think it's as a precautionary step, the recommendation is just avoid all alcohol during pregnancy, just to be on the safe side.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to circle back to or talk about that I just didn't think to ask about?
Well, the article that apparently brought me to your attention was where I calculated total IQ loss to the population of U.S. children 0 to 5 years old that could be attributable to different environmental chemicals. And I compared those estimated IQ losses to those associated with things like congenital heart disease and traumatic brain injury, iron deficiency, things that are well recognized as risks to children's brain development. And the reason I took this approach of calculating the total IQ loss in the population was because over the course of my career in talking to groups about the impact of environmental chemicals, I would report say that lead is going from 0 to 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead in the blood is associated with a 5 or 6 point IQ loss. And a surprising number of people would say, well, that's not very much. Why do we have to be concerned about that? You need to do specialized testing in order to identify it, and it's within the range of error in measurement of IQ. And so, it's probably not very important. It's certainly not as important as iron deficiency or traumatic brain injury. So I wanted to get away from that focus on the individual child and talk about what the exposures might be doing in the entire population. And so I basically added up how many total IQ points are lost in the entire population as a result of these different medical events and conditions and environmental exposures. And the thing about environmental exposures is that they're very prevalent. And as we've discussed, we all have many chemicals detectable in our blood. And so every child contributes to the population burden of these chemicals. So in the case of lead, I calculated that currently in the cohort of 0 to 5-year-old children, we're losing about 23 million IQ points among those children because of lead. Whereas for congenital heart disease, it's about 100,000. Now, congenital heart disease is very important to the patient and family, but the most serious forms occur with a frequency of 4 per thousand. So they're quite rare. So when we look at, in combination, the effect size of the condition or exposure and the prevalence, we get a very different picture. And I think it communicates that if we want to improve the brain development in our society, then we ought to focus on these prevalent exposures. Actually, similar calculation on what the IQ loss would have been among 0 to 5-year-old children in the U.S. back in the 1970s before lead was taken out of gasoline. And I calculated that by taking lead out of gasoline, we've seen a savings of 100 million IQ points.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So 100 million IQ points. Put that in context. I mean, your average person, by definition, has 100 points of IQ. So that's literally like an extra 1 million brains in the service of society based on changes in lead policy in the 1970s, if those calculations are correct. But I think that Dr. Bellinger would actually characterize it differently, because we're not changing the absolute number of human beings, human brains that exist, but instead putting a small skew on the intelligence of those individual brains, many more than 1 million people. And I think one could really argue that the way that society works now that we're not hay balers and bricklayers and people doing manual labor jobs where it's, the sweat of your brow and the strength of your bicep that's really pushing society forward, it's not so important if the person with 100 IQ goes up to 104 points. It's more if the person that has 150 IQ goes up to 154. What does that incremental burst in the amount of genius do for the rest of society? If that allows everybody to have a taser on their iPhone or whatever cool thing you think it would be nice to have, I think it's probably the people on the far end of the high intellect spectrum and the effects that they can kind of throw back to the rest of society that are the really exciting things that happen when we can shift that bell-shaped curve of intelligence just a little bit to the right. And of course, the reason that we want to keep it from ever shifting a little bit to the left, which is what neurotoxins do. So thank you so very much to Dr. Bellinger for taking the time to share these ideas with us. Hopefully there'll be a bit of inspiration for all of us as 2014 is drawing to a close. We're putting our 2015 resolutions together, and things like keeping neurotoxins off your family's dinner table should probably be pretty chief among them. Hopefully that's not the only thing important that you're going to be doing with your coming year, but as you're kind of thinking of the secondary, tertiary resolutions, the ones that aren't necessarily inspiring but are still a pretty big deal, avoidance of neurotoxins should probably be on there. And now, the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Okay, so as promised, some research from California Institute of Technology about how your brain's speed of processing can affect your dietary choices. So researchers took a bunch of people, they gave them a bunch of photos of different well-known foods, junk food, health food, everything in between, and they asked people to rate these things independently. They had them rated on how healthy a food was, how tasty a food was, and then also on the overall satisfaction that they would get from eating a food. Then they had these foods randomly paired with one another. Sometimes it would be two health foods together, sometimes it would be two junk foods together, sometimes it would be combo, and ask people to choose what they actually would eat. Now, what they found as a general pattern is that people are quicker at analyzing a food's tastiness than its health content. They think that this is probably, and this is speculating, but because something like a food's taste is a little bit more readily apparent from our senses, we know it intuitively how things taste if it's something that we've eaten before, whereas the health content of a certain food is more of a learned thing. It's a little bit more of an abstract, something that we have to reach deeper into the recesses of our brain to get that information out. Normally, there's about a 0.2 second delay for most people between when the tastiness analysis comes back from our brain versus when the health analysis comes back from our brain. And that 0.2 seconds, although it might not sound like a lot, can make a lot of difference as far as the dietary choices of whether we actually go ahead and reach for the Snickers bar versus reach for the Brussels sprout or whatever it is. The takeaway from this, as far as how we might optimize our own dietary choices, knowing this about the way that our brains process food information, is to maybe just take a little bit longer, just put the brakes on a little bit, recognize that your food's probably not going to skitter off your plate, nobody's going to grab it out of your hand and run away with it, and when you're making a decision about what you're going to eat next, give your brain that extra little bit to process what you know about the health content of a food rather than just being overwhelmed by that quick access information about a food's taste. Kind of reminds me of the advice actually about if you're going to say something nasty to somebody in an argument that you know you're going to regret, to take a second, calm down, force yourself to do a few deep breaths, and then go ahead, and if you still really want to say the nasty thing, say the nasty thing. Kind of be a little bit more deliberate about your food choices in a very similar way.
Smart Drug Smarts. The podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
And that is the entire episode. Thank you very much for listening to Smart Drug Smarts in 2014. We'll be back at you next year at approximately the same time with exactly the same podcast and the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. As usual, everything that we talked about here will be linked to on smartdrugsmarts.com. Have a great and safe New Year's. Maintain a couple of brain cells despite whatever level of partying you might do to ring in the new year. And as always, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.